I in fact want to start with, that's why I've come with this jhola on stage. Dr. Ganesh Devi ji spoke about the constitution and the crisis that the constitution is in. I think we have to carry this proudly on our sleeve. Each of us, of course, we all might have different views on the constitution, but it is important in the times that we are in today. This is an important marker of our unity, of our strength, and of our vision for this country. So we must hold the constitution high. We must carry it proudly on our sleeve. This is from our friend Vinay. They produce these bags in Karnataka. Karnataka actually produces many, many beautiful things, including, of course, the legendary Basavanna, Akka Mahadevi, Kuvempu, and the kinds of social and cultural revolutionaries and icons who I think continue to inspire, and we cannot not remember Professor Kalburgi or Gauri Lankesh being in Karnataka today, and I think we owe to them our current struggle. In fact, I was also thinking when some of our friends were talking about the past decade in particular, there have been resistances over so many decades, but I think for the current discussion, we limit ourselves to the last one decade. One of the immediate resistances that happened after 2014 was the institutional murder of Rohit Vemula and Radhika Vemula, mother of Rohit Vemula, standing up, and subsequently Payal Tadvi's institutional murder and her parents, her mother in particular, Abida Tadvi, standing up. So I think, friends, I want to remind ourselves of these two mothers today. These mothers, to this day, they are standing strong. It is almost one decade. We draw our strength also from these mothers. We are seeing that the UGC regulations that have come, there is a counter mobilization to that. But the intervention of Radhika Vemula, the intervention of Payal Tadvi in the Supreme Court is something that we should not forget. And there are many, many such interventions that not just legally, but also in terms of the struggle have been happening. So I think there are so many known and unknown sources of strength and courage that I think as people's movements we all can draw from. And in the long line of Buddha, Basava and Bhimrao, of course I know that the previous speakers have painted a picture of, I wouldn't just say grim, but it is genuinely a realistic picture of what are the timelines of challenges before us. Dr. Ganeshji has very clearly spelled that out. But I think we should also look at this within the framework of, whilst we look at some of the immediate challenges and how do we, whether it is vis-a-vis the censors, whether it is vis-a-vis the exercise of delimitation, how do we as people's movements and coalitions, I'll come to what probably could be our vision of how we see other non-BJP political parties and their role, both in terms of their accountability and also in terms of for their own existence and survival and as players in the larger democracy, what their role should be. That's one part of the entire conversation. But also our own independent role as people's struggles and people's movements who would hold on the ethical compass. And I think that is the strength or the value that we as independent people's movements and people's struggles would be able to bring to this entire challenge that we are currently faced with, and something that all our previous speakers also mentioned about. I was actually thinking whether we look at the SIR question or we look at multiple other such attacks, the issue of citizenship is something very, very central in today's times. And therefore, we, even as we fight or take on the SIR, of course, it is in yesterday's meeting also there were references as to how the kind of response or uprising that is necessary. Of course, people are facing challenges, people are facing mass exclusions, but the counter response that probably happened in the times of CA NRC is probably not similar in the context of SIR. I think that's one part of what we are faced with, but nevertheless, there are different ways in which locally mobilizations are happening, and it's also important to connect the other ongoing struggles. SIR is not a struggle that can be fought in isolation. The SIR struggle has to be understood, has to be contextualized within the ongoing multiple other struggles, and the disenfranchisement, both the struggle for citizenship and the exercise of disenfranchisement that the BJP RSS wants to do, is connected to the other assertions, other struggles that people are successfully fighting, and across so many states that we see today. I think there is a lack of time, so one will not go into the many kinds of struggles that are happening. But whether it is for safeguarding their Jal Jangal Zameen, the most recent examples being the uprising across the Aravalis that we are seeing, or even in smaller, lesser known places like Goa. I don't know if someone from Goa is here today, but the huge uprising of the Goan grassroots movements against coal transportation, the struggles that we are seeing, whether it is in far-flung states like Arunachal that we might not hear about many times, against of the Idu Mishmi Adivasis, against the large dams and hydro projects over there, so on and so forth. Or even in our central and eastern states, not just specific struggles, but also broad coalitions, whether it is the Chhattisgarh Bachao Andolan and the multiple movements, whether it is Hasdev, etc. Likewise in Jharkhand, the Jharkhand Janadhikar Mahasabha. So there is a mobilization that is happening at the level of numerous states as well. I think as we paint a picture of today's India, it is important to also acknowledge that there are these different formations, there are these different struggles, and they are posing a counter response. Now, whether that is adequate, whether that addresses all issues of our times is a different thing, but I think it is definitely useful and valuable to kind of look at these various ongoing contemporary movements. If one looks at the larger framework of other issues, I think one of our previous speakers spoke about public health, education, and these are areas where coalitions, whether it is the Jan Swasthya Abhiyan or whether it is the All India Forum for Right to Education, these are coalitions that have existed for very long. Of course, a lot of political content, a lot of political mobilization around many of these important critical issues, and all of these are connected, whether it is through the questions of economic well-being, whether it is to the question of how culturally there is an assault on the very fabric of what India is. Education, healthcare, and livelihood. There have been so many movements, many times I think when a lot of us also within the quote-unquote civil society space are not used to acknowledging the not so formal, not so organized movements. But there have been so many such movements, whether it is against unemployment or even against inflation. So I think our challenge is also in how we acknowledge the different kinds of movements, how do we connect the dots. And in many contexts, there is an organic uprising. People are rising up, people are standing up. And the most recent, I mean, one might think it is an individual, but all of us have heard about Deepak Mohammed in Uttarakhand. And I think that's one of the, it could be of a very small scale, but that person has really touched the hearts of so many people, and he has actually struck a chord. Because on the one hand, there's this narrative of Hindu Khatre mein hai, and that because they've really been able to sell this thing of Hindus actually, despite being a majority, being the quote-unquote victims. So I think there is a lot of ownership responsibility from a lot of people within the broader Hindu community also to find ways and respond to the situation that no, we are not victims or anything in any case. We are actually quite well off in this country, but the core issues of livelihood, of education, of healthcare are something that also affects the Hindus, and it has gone from bad to worse during BJP's period, and that's something I think Dr. Parkala Prabhakar explained very well, although he explained it with certain specific statistics. That's something that we see in terms of response of so many other movements as well. So how do we go about connecting the various dots? Dr. Darshan Pal mentioned very in passing about the Indo-US trade deal, and I think it's important for us to also turn the tables and question these very concepts of, because constantly anyone who raises issues from the perspective of people's movements is quickly branded as anti-national or all of that. So I think to kind of get onto the offensive, not just be on the defensive, and also take on the narrative of patriotism, to take on the issue of sovereignty, because today if someone is compromising the sovereignty of India, it is the BJP RSS which is doing it. They are literally at the forefront of compromising the sovereignty of India through these multiple trade deals or through the dilutions of various laws. Again, for the lack of time, I'm not going to the detail of the multiple laws that are being diluted, but each of these legislations, there are counter resistances, there are counter struggles. There are friends from the Narega Sangharsh Morcha sitting over here who've been fighting both for the enactment of the law, for the broader struggle for workers' rights and dignity. Today, also saving the act, but also not just to limit ourselves to the act itself, but for a broader approach towards workers' right to life and right to dignity. So within that framework, whether it is the struggle to safeguard the Narega Act and resist the new so-called communally named VBG Ramji Act, whether it is the attack on the right to information law through legislations like the DPDP, there are resistances. Likewise, to challenge the, I think someone else also mentioned in brief, the institutional dilutions that we've been seeing, in particular in the last decade. And I think, friends, this is something extremely important. A lot of, we keep hearing this within the movement spaces as well, that there isn't much hope from the institutions. And I think that's a very slippery slope. We should not give back. We have to question, we have to challenge, but we have to not give back on the institutions. Whether it is the ECI, whether it is the higher judiciary, whether it is a number of other institutions who have not only been infiltrated by the BJP RSS, but their entire decision making and approach has shifted in the past decade in particular. So how do we also, as people's movements, look at salvaging and reclaiming institutions? I think going ahead, that is one of the key challenges, because as we chart a course for ourselves over the next day and a half, this is not a battle that people's movements alone can fight. Of course, we will have to be at the epicenter and the ethical center of this entire thing. But there is a role that different constituents have. And I think it is within that, in terms of enforcing the accountability of institutions, enforcing the accountability of other political parties. I don't think we can let them off the hook at all. Yes, many political parties are opportunists. Despite facing, in fact, sometimes one feels that this battle of federalism is something that these political parties should be fighting. But we see that the movements are raising the issue of federal attacks on federal attacks much more than the opposition parties are raising. So how do we get the parties to also join this broader circle? And I think it is, as Dr. Ganeshi rightly said, it is part of our collective genius maybe that we draw the circle larger. Yes, we also have to play a watchful role, because many times different political formations of different hues have their own opportunistic ways and calculated ways of how they engage in these kinds of initiatives, which is why as movements we hold the ethical string strongly, but we try and broaden the horizon, and that should include ordinary citizens. I think as movements, many times our challenge is also that we are so cast into specific constituencies, specific issue-based, and of course many of us have gotten significant victories also in that, not going into the details of that, but how do we capture the imagination of the ordinary Indian? There have been times during the farmers movement, during the Shaheen Bagh movement, where there was a certain, the pulse of the ordinary Indian was, at least to a certain extent, it was, I think a connection was drawn. So going ahead, one will also have to think through what are those frameworks, what is the language, what would be the cultural approach through which we will be able to overestimate the weaknesses of the enemy, but at the same time, I don't think we should also not undervalue our own strengths, which are very, very dispersed. So one of the core tasks going ahead is to, beyond what kinds of mobilizations, what kinds of outreach we'll be able to do, to be able to reach out to many more constituencies, many more kinds of people, and I think also broaden our definition of who is actually resisting, who is, it doesn't have to be a very textbook approach of resistance, or I don't think people have to really be full-time, full-fledged Andolan Jivis for them to be part of our movement framework. I think we really have to expand that framework much more and get on board many ordinary people, ordinary groups who are all feeling the pinch in different ways. Only in terms of articulation or in response, there could be a difference. And I think political education is also part of this whole process of churning. So how do we really look at long-term political education even as we fight fascism, even as we organize. And I think that political education will never go waste. It will in fact strengthen our collective process of democratization. So just as the BJP RSS tries to cast its net wide, I think we should cast our net even more wider, 10 times wider, reach out to many more people, build that. I don't think everyone would organically be able to connect with the kind of articulation that many times happens in these meetings. But I think it is somewhere our collective responsibility also as to how we build that and deepen that articulation and capture the imagination of the ordinary Indians. Definitely, despite all the challenges, despite the hate, I'll just take 30 seconds. Despite the hate, the venom, the impact that the toxic right wing and the capitalist forces have been having on ordinary people, and one would say broadly working class to middle class communities, there is still a huge sizable section of our country that is willing to connect with these kinds of struggles, and that is willing to save India for the better. And I think it is in that जो हम राष्ट्र निर्माण की बात कहते हैं, I don't know what language we might want to use, but to really build, while we also resist, while we articulate resistance, it is important to show very meaningful and positive examples of what kind of a nation we want to build, what kind of a society we want to build, and that might also, and that will definitely attract a lot more younger people, a lot more newer constituencies, and I think we need to unleash our creative and collective energies in that direction. Zindabad.